Well, livability is a very interesting and somehow difficult thing to look at. Obviously, if you're asking the question what makes a city good, then a primary indicator of that is the quality of life of the people who live there, the size of the population it has, whether it's gaining or losing population, and in the end, the standard of living that people enjoy. The problem is that notions of livability are very diverse. Some people think livability is all about entertainment opportunities. Other people think livability is all about the cost of housing. And some people think it's about access to the natural environment. So I think for nearly all cities, the most important thing is to think about how to provide for a growing urban population. And that tends to mean that in the long term, fixing infrastructure, which is the key means through which cities grow and accommodate more population, is key. In the medium term, getting housing markets working in such a way that they provide affordable housing as well as housing choice for a wide spectrum of people on different incomes is key. And then the third thing, I think, in the current moment when we have the growth of the sharing economy and the experience economy, is really paying attention to public space and making public space really attractive, really enjoyable, creating that sense of a shared city that you can only really get when people are able to enjoy public spaces together. So those are three things cities can do. Yes, well, I think there are probably two or three trends that really matter that haven't had much attention. One of them, of course, is that the current cycle of global urbanization that we're living through, where large numbers of people are moving to cities, and over this 100 years we'll go from about 15% to about 80% of humanity living in an urban habitat, that alongside that trend, not very much discussed, is the likelihood that the human population will actually peak and then stabilize. Seems to me that's very important, because what it means is that as these cities grow in the current cycle, we will eventually get to a point where cities only grow by changing the shift or the share that they have of the urban population, and we'll stop having to think about how we accommodate population growth per se and can rather look at a more settled set of cities. So that's one trend. The second trend that I think is very important is the aging of the human population and how we start to provide in a much more coherent way for older people to live in cities. And then the third part, I guess, is that the implications that the digital economy and the growth of these many technologies has for urban centres, for places. It's one thing for everybody to want to do their retail online. It's another thing to think about what's the future of the high street, the shopping centre or the business district. So I'm rather more preoccupied with how the urban fabric adjusts to this mega trend of digitisation. And in particular, I think this calls into place the desire to create locations that are much more attractive, to build communities around them, to focus on the branding, to think much more about the mix of activities that happens within the built environment. And I think that's actually very exciting. Yes, well, I think that there are many more advantages than disadvantages. For Singapore, having a very powerful, strong national government that's able to act in a coordinated way with whole-of-government approaches and the ability to manage its balance sheet in some kind of integrated way provides huge benefits for Singapore. And that's why Singapore has been able to invest so dramatically in infrastructure, to radically improve the quality of housing, healthcare, education. It's been able to lead and determine its own economic development paths and strategies. And Singapore has been able, in a short 50-year period, to transform itself into a high quality of life nation. Now, are there any disadvantages from being a strong sort of city-state government? Well, very difficult to find any, but if there were any, it would be perhaps the risk that government is so dominant that it might drive out some of the role of civic, citizen and business organisations that one often sees in other cities playing an important role in innovation. Or it might be the case that although government is very competent and very able to deliver change, actually it might be important to have a broader base of thinking and debate and discourse about the future. And it might also be the case that if you have a very strong city-state government of this kind, you might reduce over time your innovative capacity as people become complacent and happy with what they've got. Sometimes you need the friction of fragmentation in order to spur innovation. But I should stress, I don't see any of these problems as being really big problems for Singapore. I think that actually the strength of Singapore's unified city-state government is an inspiration for most other world cities, and it provides perhaps pathways or pilots, examples of how and what city government can do when it is properly empowered and it is properly integrated. Well, in general, of course, if a city government or a city-state or a nation-state is able to meet all of its own investment requirements and all of its own service requirements through its own resources, that's a very good thing. Having a low level of debt and a high level investment is a kind of utopia. And nobody would argue, I think, that Singapore or Hamburg have got it wrong. But for many cities around the world, investing in the infrastructure required to achieve managed growth rather than unmanaged growth does require them to access capital beyond their own fiscal resources, either because they're not allowed to borrow money in their own name or because their fiscal resources are not at this point credible enough to sustain the kind of borrowing they would need to do. And for those cities, there are some benefits of integrating private capital into a public investment model. Those benefits, of course, include improved discipline in the way projects and infrastructure is managed. It includes improved cost-benefit analysis. It includes improved risk assessment. It often increases the level of innovation that's applied with the capital. So the private sector, when it brings money, brings other things too. And it's the other things, the less tangible things, the quality, the innovation, the discipline, that's often very important. Having said that, of course, introducing private capital into public goods, it always requires some very careful stewardship on the part of government so that the private capital doesn't simply become rent-seeking and seek only to make a profit without actually producing the public goods itself. So there are challenges as well as opportunities that come from engaging with private capital. Yes, well, this is the big challenge of the current moment, which is, if you like, is one of the unintended consequences of the way the global economy is moving at the moment, and particularly the relationship it has with high levels of migration, poor people entering cities, becoming very competitive labour markets for very low-skilled, very low-paid jobs in cities these days, or the growth of technology and the role it has in, as it were, destroying jobs or increasing productivity so that low productivity jobs no longer needed in quite the same way. Well, cities face very big challenges here. I think the first thing to say is that for most cities this requires them to engage in a much longer term program of growth planning, growth management and investment for growth. And in particular that requires investment in housing and infrastructure, because the only way cities can really manage growth is by using the land better and connecting people more efficiently so that greater density is possible. So there's a big planning and investment task here. Secondly, there's a recognition, I think, that our educational systems have not been sufficient for the challenges of modern-day labour markets. Too many people in cities go through the formal structures of education but never become equipped for the world of work in which they then find themselves. So there's a strong desire, I think, to revolutionise education in all sorts of ways, and in particular to move away from the standardised forms that are not really working very well. And then the third area here, I think, is for cities to get much more involved in building, as it were, the social and the civic response to some of these issues of disadvantage. I mentioned earlier that civic and community level social organisations are very important, not just in providing services to citizens, but also in various social innovations that make it possible to generate new solutions to some of these challenges. Some of these might use sharing economy models, some of them might use exchange schemes and other things. But I think it's very important that city governments encourage the growth of a social sector that's able to tackle some of these problems in other ways, in addition to what city governments need to do in the arena of planning, housing, infrastructure and education.